When we deal with climate change, I guess we all feel churned up. It's a very large and complex and difficult issue. And what I would like to do this evening is give you an update really on where climate science is at, what we may see unfolding over the next decade or two, and what we can do to prepare ourselves and to reduce the damage that we will otherwise face. So climate science is a very old science. It was arguably established back in 1859 in London when John Tyndall, a prominent scientist of the day, demonstrated that the carbon dioxide molecule can trap heat energy. And within a few years of that demonstration, people were speculating about how varying concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere may have affected life in the past, may have affected ancient climates. By 1903, a Swedish Nobel Prize-winning chemist by the name of Svante Arrhenius decided to try to quantify how much additional warming, CO2, would add to the atmosphere. This involved countless thousands of very complex mathematical calculations that he had to make. We're very fortunate that Svante Arrhenius was living in a very unhappy marriage, and he was quite content to spend as much as 18 hours a day in his office making these calculations. And after several years being occupied that way, he managed to come up with a calculation which is still largely valid today. His only comment on his calculation was that we weren't burning coal fast enough. He lived in Stockholm, and he said, at the rate that we're burning coal today, my city is going to remain miserably cold for 3,000 years before it gets a climate like that of Rome. So by the 1970s, we had the first computer-generated models of how the climate system would change as we doubled the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and those computer models confirmed Svante Arrhenius's basic work. By doubling the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, we would increase the temperature of the surface of Earth by between 2 and 3 degrees on average. Now, the concentration of CO2 before the Industrial Revolution was at about 280 parts per million. We are currently at about 410 parts per million, and a doubling, of course, is 560 parts per million. It's important to understand the scale of the flow of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. It is very difficult to comprehend because the scale is so large. We currently put between 50 and 60 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere every year. When we look at the atmosphere, it looks like it's very large, that it goes on forever. But in fact, the atmosphere is about as thick around our planet as the outermost skin of an onion is, the parchment skin of an onion on an onion. The atmosphere is 500 times smaller than the oceans. So as we send those very large flows of pollution into the atmosphere, we change the composition of the air we breathe. I want to give you a sense of how large those volumes of pollution are. So just let's carry out an imaginary experiment. Let's ask ourselves how many trees we need to plant to draw down just 1/10 of that flow, just 5 gigatons. Now trees, we all know about trees. Many people labour under the misunderstanding that they grow from their roots. Trees don't grow from their roots, they grow from their leaves. The leaves have small holes in them that lets the air in. Through the magic of photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide molecule is broken down and the carbon builds all of the tissues you see in that tree before you. So we can get a sense roughly of how much carbon dioxide a tree has drawn down over its lifetime. So how many trees would we need to plant to draw down 5 gigatons? It turns out that we'd need to plant enough trees to cover the lower 48 states of the USA, the whole of that area from Death Valley to New York City, and those trees would have to grow vigorously for a century in order to draw down on average about 5 gigatons per year. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the problem we face. We are unfortunately at a very critical moment in terms of CO2 concentrations. Up until very recently, for most people, climate change has been a theoretical issue. We haven't lived the experience of climate change. But over the last few years, we are seeing such large-scale impacts that increasing number of people are actually living the experience of climate change. I reside in the city of Sydney in Australia, and I can tell you right now that the people of that city of 5 million people are experiencing the direct impacts of climate change. We have uncontrolled bushfires raging around the city and further north in unprecedented conditions. And it's not even summer yet. We're used to bushfires in January and February. This is November. It's outside the fire season. I think that we're at the beginning of the decade of consequences, where the greenhouse gas concentration has built up enough that we can expect to see very significant change. Among the most impactful of those changes will be things like sea level rise. The latest projections for sea level rise anticipate that over the next 80 years or so, the sea will rise in excess of 2 metres, and that we'll see something like 200 million people displaced from their homes, many of those people in South Asia, here in India and elsewhere. Another very concerning impact has been the impact on food security. After decades of increasing food security, we now find ourselves in a position whereby global hunger has increased 3 years running over the last 3 years, due to extreme weather events and the impacts of extreme weather events on crop production. Water security is another major issue. You've probably watched in the news as cities as far afield as Cape Town, Chennai, and now Australia and California have all suffered real crises of water availability. These impacts are all exacerbated by climate change. Heat waves, typhoons, bushfires, some epidemic diseases will all be exacerbated as our climate shifts. If we look forward 20, 30, 40 years, we see, I think, a world that is deeply disturbing unless we act. A world within which starvation has returned, large-scale starvation, within which water security is a major problem, and within which sea level rise is so stressing our economic systems and our social cohesion that states and global cooperation will start to fall apart, to disintegrate. The reason I'm involved with climate change is that I don't want to bequeath that world to my children. I have 3 children and I do not want to leave that world to them. I know we can do so much better. What do we need to do to act to avert the dangers that we face? The first thing we need to do globally is start to reduce emissions. I was Australia's Climate Commissioner in 2011, and the very first report that we produced was called The Critical Decade. It argued that over that decade, from 2010 to 2020, we had to reduce emissions very substantially, otherwise we'd face serious problems. Instead, the reverse has happened. Last year, emissions from human activities grew by 1.7%, and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere went up by 3.5 parts per million, the highest ever recorded increase. This year looks like CO2 emissions will grow again. And yet we're already facing these impacts which are well in advance of what the computer models suggested they might be. Faced with an emergency like that, we can see the actions of government and even the Paris Agreement are very inadequate to deal with the problem. And I'd just like to say at this point too that the climate problem is so interlinked with so many of the other problems that we face. So just standard air pollution is linked to climate change. Air pollution in places like Delhi results from combustion, from the burning of crop waste, from the burning of fossil fuels, which all contribute to climate change. Our food security issues are tied up with climate change, our water security issues, and our economy, all tied together. I'm very surprised when I come to places like India to see that the government response is so incoherent, that there isn't a very directed approach which seeks to implement multi-potent solutions that solve more than one problem at once. And later on in this lecture, I'll argue about what some of those solutions might be. So first, we must reduce emissions. India has actually done fairly well at that. You have had a reduction in per capita emissions over the years, and you have a very ambitious solar program, which I think will stand the country in good stead. What's holding that action back is two things really. One is that a lot of power generation assets are in the hands of the states and federal policy can only do so much. And the second is the economic distortions caused by subsidies to some of these polluting industries. Makes it much harder to transition. Nevertheless, it must be done. We also have to realise that we are at a point in the climate crisis where it is no longer possible to solve the problem just by cutting emissions. The burden of greenhouse gases has grown too great for that. So of those 50 or 60 gigatons we put into the air every year, about 25% of that will stay in the atmosphere forever, for geological time, unless we find a way of removing it. And there are groups around the world who are looking at how we might actually remove some of that pollution from the atmosphere. You can think of it as a form of recycling. It's not so different in some ways from recycling plastic bags or recycling runoff, fertilisers in runoff or whatever else. The CO2 is a pollutant in the atmosphere which can be taken back out of the atmosphere and used for good purpose. Witness the tree. That is, or was, years back, atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now it's serving to shade us, to protect our soils and produce food. So recycling CO2 out of the atmosphere is good. As I mentioned earlier though, the number of trees we need to plant to deal with this problem is so massive it simply is not possible. We use our land for our cities, for our crop production, for grazing, for our biodiversity protection, for water and many other things. Planting sufficient forests globally to deal with the problem, it's not scalable. There is also carbon, however, in our soils, and our soils can act as a good repository for carbon. But that will require changes to our agricultural practices and to our grazing practices that will give us the capacity not only to store carbon in our soils, but to increase our productivity as we do so. And I'll just give you one single example of that. Rotational grazing is a global phenomenon now. It came out of Zimbabwe originally. It's simply a means of moving livestock around a pasture so that they fully consume all of the vegetation in one area and don't return to that area for 9 to 12 months. That rotational grazing can result in increased soil carbon, increased productivity, and an increased stocking rate of up to 50% in Australia. So you have 50% more livestock at the same time you sequester carbon. These are no regrets steps that we can take. They won't solve the problem, but they will help reduce the burden. If we want to look for scalable solutions, we have to look offshore. The oceans are 70% of the surface of our planet, 71%, round figures. And seaweed, which grows in the oceans and in fresh waters, is the fastest growing plant we know about. Seaweed, brown algae, can grow 60 centimetres a day. And there are two really important things to understand about seaweed. Not only can seaweed capture carbon very rapidly because of its strong growth, it also takes the acid out of the oceans. So as it grows, it absorbs that carbon dioxide out of the oceans and it fixes the carbon in its own tissues. Ocean water that's less acidic is far more productive because the fish that need to grow skeletons and the shellfish that grow shells grow so much more strongly where the water is not acidic. So increasingly today we are seeing a practice called ocean permaculture develop, whereby within a seaweed farm people are also producing large volumes of fish and shellfish for commercial sale. My vision and the vision of others for this, and you can find this on TED, I've given a TED talk on this if you want more information, but my vision is that offshore seaweed farms could capture that carbon very quickly. We could harvest the seaweed and drop it into the ocean depths, and once it's down a kilometre, the carbon is out of circulation for centuries, if not thousands of years. We could also be helping feed the planet in those seaweed farms. If we could cover 9% of the world's ocean in seaweed farms, we could draw down the equivalent of all of the greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere every year, as well as produce enough fish and shellfish to feed a global population of 10 billion people with 200 kilograms of high quality protein per year. Now, we're not going to get to anywhere near those numbers in my lifetime or your lifetime. 9% of the world's oceans is an area 4.5 times the size of Australia. Very, very large. But we can start now doing the due diligence on these studies, finding out if there are adverse impacts that may occur, working out what the economics are, starting to look at the oceans as a solution to climate change rather than just as an inert victim. There are other ways of drawing CO2 out of the air. We can use a category of rocks called silicate rocks. We can grind up those rocks and spread them on fields for fertiliser, or put them into the ocean or on beaches where they decompose, and as they decompose they draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The only problem with that solution is that how do we quarry rocks today? We use fossil fuels to quarry and grind up rocks, so it makes no sense to try to capture CO2 if you're expending CO2 to do so. In future, as we green our electricity grid and green our transport, we will have an option for doing just that. In the short term, my fear is that we will see a destabilisation of the climate system within the next decade or two if we fail to act, and there'll be some very adverse consequences over that time. One of them will be the melting of the Arctic ice cap. We are on the verge of losing the Arctic ice cap today. And there are serious researchers at the moment who are looking at how we might protect that ice cap using geoengineering. So some of these solutions involve putting sulphur into the fuel of jets which fly over the Arctic Circle, and that sulphur forms a kind of, it's a polluting cloud in the stratosphere, but it protects the oceans from absorbing heat. It protects it from sunlight. I'm really disturbed by these solutions because they're like a band-aid. They don't deal with the problem, they simply put a band-aid over the manifestation. Moreover, the scientific modelling that's been done to justify these experiments involves study of sulphur put into the atmosphere by volcanoes, not by jet aircraft. And that is a very different situation. But what those models already reveal is that sulphur in the stratosphere has a big impact on the Indian monsoon. You can imagine a situation where a country like China, faced with massive coastal inundation or other problems, may seek to put sulphur into the atmosphere over the Arctic. It's cheap to do so, it's instantly effective to do so. and yet the consequences of doing so could be quite profound. We have no global treaty, we have no ongoing discussions about how we regulate such geoengineering options, and yet I can see in the next 5 or 10 years we may be reaching for them. So what is our way out of this? Let's think about the very local, just for a moment. I've been in India now just 3 days, and in Hyderabad for a day. But I've learnt a little bit about your society. One thing I know is that in this state you don't have a climate commissioner. Now, a climate commissioner could be a very useful position to have, particularly if you charge that person with simply engaging with the public to talk about climate change, to talk about the threats, the options, the opportunities. That way you have an educated populace who can make informed decisions. I was Climate Commissioner in Australia for 3 years, and I can tell you how powerful that dialoguing is. If you had a Climate Commissioner that went around to every city and large village in the region, holding forums, talking in a simple language people can understand about climate change, asking about people's experience of climate change and what can be done about it. Secondly, I'd like to suggest that we don't think about clean energy, wind and solar, just as a replacement for existing fossil fuels. What young Indians need to ask themselves is, what could we do if we didn't just do 100% replacement of fossil fuels, but did 500%? So you have large volumes of cheap, clean energy. What could be done then? Could you develop secondary industrial processes on your primary things? Could you do processing? Could you be using desalination for water? Could you be using that energy to clean up your lakes and rivers, to power seaweed races, so you're getting the pollutants out of the water? Could you open up new opportunities for young Indians in this state to live a better future than they would otherwise live? I think the answer is yes, but we need the vision and the long-term planning to deliver those particular outcomes. We also need India to engage honestly and meaningfully in the climate debate. I've been in the COPs for years. These are the meetings where we dialogue on climate change. And even coming to India today, I hear the same arguments. And the arguments are that, well, you Westerners caused most of the problem and you've become very wealthy from doing it. Why should we do anything? And it is absolutely true that that is a grossly unjust situation. But the fact of the matter is that today we live on a planet that's like a leaky boat. It's sinking. And unless we all bail, unless we all help get the water out of the boat, we will sink. We must find ways forward that allow us to solve more than one problem at one time. India is beset with problems, as is Australia. We need vision, we need education and engagement that lets us thread a way forward using the few assets we have, and those few assets are our clean energy, our social cohesion and our natural environment, to use those assets to find the appropriate solutions. I'm a visitor to India, but I know this country is full of ingenious young men and women who, given half a chance, could transform this country into a world-leading economy and a truly magnificent place to live. The option of doing nothing, quite frankly, is unthinkable. I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
I'll ask the audience to get up with their questions. Before that, I have one question. Very recently, we read a book by David Wells Wallace called The Uninhabitable Earth. And that book lays down a scenario which is almost like apocalypse. What's your view on that?
Look, the reason that I'm in India now and the reason I have devoted my life to doing this is that I believe that it's entirely possible we will create an apocalyptic Earth if we do nothing. And I have 3 children and I will not allow that.
I'd like to ask whether this Jacinda Ardern's zero carbon policy that she has recently expounded. How doable is it?
Yes, it is extremely doable for New Zealand. New Zealand is very rich in renewable energy assets. It has high wind capacity, it has some solar, and it has magnificent hydroelectric assets. I think it is completely doable. The issues that New Zealand faces are largely agricultural issues, and because they're selling products into an open market, it will require a partnership between government and industry that's a very meaningful partnership. But it's interesting, I came to India via New Zealand. I was speaking to Air New Zealand about how they may engage to lower their carbon intensity by using biofuels and other things. And I came away very optimistic that New Zealand is now set on the right path. And they'll have a much easier time of it than India or Australia, I think, because they're so well endowed with...
Political leaders do not do that. What do you think could be or should be done so that they get educated on this?
I think it's very hard to know what someone actually believes, but we can infer through the actions of people like Trump and others that they have something to gain from denying climate change. And I know in the case of Australia that there is a gross corrupting influence coming from the fossil fuel industry. Ministers leave their portfolios in Australia and take up positions on the boards of mining companies shortly after they leave office. We know that in the past, coal companies have written our energy policy, coal company lobbyists have written our energy policy in Australia and have interfered in other ways. There's been quite open public campaigning as well to change people's minds. So you're right, there's a lot of political leaders who are captured by vested interests out there. We simply have to push past that. And young people are doing that now. You see with the school strikes, with Extinction Rebellion, people are taking to the streets because they're realising the importance of this issue now. And to be honest with you, it is in the interests of those fossil fuel companies to recognise the reality of the situation they're in. Building new fossil fuel assets now is tantamount to throwing your money away because those assets will become stranded. The world has to take action in short order on this, otherwise our economy and our society will unravel. So I think I acknowledge what you say, that it's made so much more difficult by people like Trump. But the American response was great. 250 mayors and governors stood up and said, we will do it. So that's the spirit in question. I can only say that the screws are slowly tightening on companies to become transparent. We have the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a very important initiative, a global initiative, which is making sure that companies are accountable. So they're saying, you know, if you have a carbon liability, this needs to be taken into account at board level. We are seeing pressure from insurance companies who simply won't insure companies with a high carbon exposure now. And we are seeing investors finally, through investor agitation and through also some of the larger banks, who now refuse to lend money to companies with large carbon liabilities. I think some of the bigger problems in this country are around some of the family-owned companies, some of the ones that are not listed and not under those pressures, and companies that have their own pile of assets to build. I don't have any solutions for that. In Australia, we have the same problem. We have mega wealthy individuals who are best friends with prime ministers and with ministers who have undue influence. Europe has done some interesting things in that area, and I know I'm drifting off the subject now, but in Belgium and in Ireland, we've seen initiatives whereby a number of positions in Parliament are given to individuals chosen at random off the electoral roll. It's a process called sortition. And they're only there for a short time, 6 months or 12 months. But I think we get a better outcome from 100 individuals chosen at random off the electoral roll in Hyderabad than we would from our elected representatives in many issues. So perhaps in the longer term there are ways of reforming our democracy that get better outcomes. So I've drifted away from the question.
I have a question. Earth itself goes through many cycles of ice ages and warming up and closing, and there's some literature suggests that what's happening in climate change is actually fundamentally what's happening to the Earth,
Yes.
and what we are discussing now
Yeah.
is not exactly relevant. How far do you subscribe to that?
Look, that's an excellent question, and I perhaps should have explained earlier on. The reason we know that it's human pollution causing the problems is that we can use the climate models to do something called backcasting. And in backcasting, what we ask the computer to do is to project what the climate would have been like for a period in the past. So some of the best data has come from analysis of the 20th century, where we have good climate records. We know what happened to the temperature across our planet in different regions through that time. And we can say to the computer, okay, just use information from the natural climate system. Don't use any inputs from human pollution, and see if you can replicate the the real temperature record that occurred. There is not a single instance on our planet where that can be done. But when you ask the computer to see if it can predict that known record for the 20th century by using both natural factors and human pollution, in every case they match up for the dozens of regions of the world where this has been done. So that is very strong proof that it is the human element that is creating the change. Of course there are natural elements as well that continue on in the background, but the human element has now overwhelmed those natural elements and is changing the trajectory of the Earth's climate.
And people around the world.
Yes.
And that seems to be so inbuilt into our economic system now.
Yeah, the issue of transport as a whole is a very serious issue for us. 30 and 40% of our global emissions come from the transport sector. And some parts of that transport sector are much more difficult to reform than others. So we have seen very large advances made in the electrification of ground transport in recent years. Places like Sweden and Shenzhen in China have electric bus services now. They don't use petrol for those. We have seen the rise of the electric car in China and in California. They're still at relatively small numbers. I mean, 90 million cars are manufactured every year. Of those, around 1 million, plus or minus a million, are electric. But that's increasing. When it comes to shipping, we have a different problem. Ships last quite a long time. We know that we can move those ships onto compressed natural gas, for example, as a fuel source, and that's increasingly happening. But we need to decarbonise that form of transport, and I think it's fair to say that no one yet has the vision as to how that will be done, even though we need it to be done. For airlines, the issue is slightly more optimistic. Jet fuel now can be made from carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, as well as other sources. And the incremental cost of some of those very clean burning jet fuels is about 25%. So they cost 25% more, but those costs will go down as production ramps up. Sweden has already committed to running its domestic air fleet on biofuels or jet fuels by 2030. So I hope I've gone some way towards answering that question.
The shipping, we just include the transport costs, packing
Yes.
costs and conservation costs, but we don't really include the social costs.
Yes.
Or the environmental costs of doing it. And you know, it makes people, I feel, long distances away, who are the producers, feel very helpless.
Yes.
And they don't feel any control over the process at all. Isn't that a very significant?
Agriculture is one of the reasons for deforestation and all that. So it's a vicious cycle. You can't stop agriculture or the demand because of the growing population. Israel has done a lot in that sector, really revolutionized agriculture, the likes of hydroponics and aquaponics. If we take up those at a war footing, do you think it'll kind of make, do you think it'll make, at least start a change in the climate?
Yes. Look, overall, if we look at all of the sources of greenhouse gas pollution, about 23% comes from what's called agriculture, forestry and other land use, which means around 80% comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So tonight I've concentrated on fossil fuels because it's the lion's share of the problem. But you're quite right about agriculture, and the good thing about agriculture is that we have the power to change things quite quickly in that area. So the adoption of a balanced diet would do a lot to improve the situation for us. It would address issues of human health as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the key elements in a balanced diet is reducing the amount of meat that's eaten in developed countries, places like the US particularly, where it's leading to obesity and other sorts of problems. In terms of sustainability in agriculture, there's a lot going on. I was out at the Institute for Business Studies just here in town earlier today, where we met an agricultural expert whose expertise was in dry land agriculture and who was arguing for the retention of stubble between crops, so that instead of burning the stubble and leading to air pollution, you keep it there and change the way you sow the seeds for the next crop. So there's much can be done. I agree with you, and it needs to be a big focus. I'm not an expert in that area, so it's hard for me to answer the question fully, but I agree with you wholeheartedly that much can be done.
If you're telling you need to harvest seaweeds and put them in the ocean at least 9%, or if we start now, what do you think, like, we need to harvest them separately on land and put them and see how is it feasible practically? Will they grow automatically?
Yeah, it exists in the world at the moment. It's what we're talking about is offshore seaweed. So this is seaweed that's grown out of sight of land, on racks, over deep water, where you can cut off the seaweed and let it sink, and then use aquaculture. Now, it's technically very challenging. I can talk you through the details of it later, but I don't want to subject the audience to the full detailed analysis of how this is done. But it's an interesting area. But could I just say that overall, seaweed is a vastly underestimated resource. In Australia, researchers are working on a particular form of red seaweed called Asparagopsis that has the potential to dramatically decrease methane from cattle. Like, this is 90% plus decreases. And all of that energy then that would have gone into the methane goes into the cow. You get healthier cows and faster growing cows. There are other people in Australia, and again I'm involved with them, who are using seaweed to clean up human sewage, to clean up the runoff from aquaculture ponds, with magnificent results. In the aquaculture ponds where we grow prawns, the company that I'm involved with, the water that comes into those ponds is dirtier than the water that goes out, because the seaweed does such a great job of cleaning up all of the pollutants that otherwise would flow onto the Great Barrier Reef and destroy the coral. And the great benefit of doing that is that seaweed is itself a crop. We get 3 tonnes a day of seaweed out of those seaweed races, which can be turned into fertiliser. So basically you're just closing the loop on fertiliser use. Runs off from the land, goes through the water, the aquaculture farm is taken out by the seaweed and put back onto the land again. So I think we don't give enough thought to the use of seaweed as a multi-potent solution that can improve water quality, improve food production, draw carbon out of the atmosphere, and be used for many, many other purposes. In terms of water quality and in terms of carbon sequestration and food security. I'm really deeply concerned about food security in this country, and I think you need to hedge your bets, particularly given the climate impacts that we can see coming down the pipeline. And ocean-based aquaculture is a very good way of thinking about doing that, because it's somewhat independent from the impacts that disturb production on land.
The climate change and things like that, can you just throw a little light on what are the major factors which are fueling the increase in fires out there?
Certainly. The first thing to understand is that in Australia there are usually enough sources of ignition to burn any fuel that accumulate. So it's not arsonists or people lighting fires that are the problem, it's the fuel that is the problem. And what climate change has done is that CO2 effectively acts like a fertiliser for woody plants and lets them grow faster, so we have more fuel. It's also caused a drying trend, so there is less water availability, and it has also caused an increase in temperature. And we have also experienced an increase in windiness at the same time. So put all of that together and you get a very dramatic change in fire behaviour. So when I was growing up in Australia, and even when I was in my middle age, we had a fire season that was restricted to 4 or 5 months in New South Wales and even less in Victoria. And the fire services across the country would help each other as the fire season progressed, north to south. And when fires were burning in California, it was cool in Australia, so we would send our firefighters to California to assist, and the Californians would send their firefighters to Australia to assist us during our fire season. We now, in New South Wales, have a fire season that runs for 11 months of the year. 11 months of the year. We have 1 month which is now fire-free, which is June. That means that no one can send resources to anyone else to help fight these fires. The behaviours of the fires themselves are changing very dramatically because there is more fuel, it's drier and windier and hotter. And fire does not respond in an arithmetic way to these inputs. The nature of the fire itself changes, and we're seeing fire events where the fire simply cannot be fought. And that the warning the government gives is you must leave your home before you see the smoke. Otherwise, there is a high likelihood you'll be caught out. So the situation is very dangerous for us and very dismaying. I personally have lost a house to fire in Australia. And my houses around, I've got a house and a little holiday shack, both of which are potentially threatened by fire during this season. So, and I have a friend who's unaccounted for in this current fire situation. So I really worry about that. I mean, that brings home to Australians in a very real way the dangers of climate change, and yet we still have a government that refuses to act. The depths of self-interest by some politicians beg a belief, is all I can say. More fuel, hotter conditions, drier conditions, windier conditions. And there is enough sources of ignition all of the time in Australia for fires to start. It may be 2 dry sticks rubbing together in the wind. It may be someone dropping a cigarette. It might be a lightning strike. But there are enough of those ignition sources all of the time to burn the fuel. What is required for a fire in Australia are conditions that allow the fuel to burn.
If the fires in California are similar in nature?
Differ
Sure.
with you.
Yes.
The fires in Northern California, for example, the fire that devastated Paradise.
Yes.
The whole of Northern California, again, comes into what you were saying earlier about corporate greed.
Right.
Pacific Gas and Electric is an old system. They have all the business in Northern California.
Right.
It has now been traced, the fires have been traced to their failure to maintain the lines,
Yeah.
their failure to maintain the grounds around transformers,
Yeah.
their failure to turn off electricity when there were high levels of fire or air coming through, wind. The secondary reason, now they're saying in Northern California, is a particular non-indigenous plant,
Yeah.
which is particularly fire prone.
Yeah.
But since I have the mic, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
The New York Times has in recent times produced 2 wonderful, wonderful world maps. The first one shows the major cities of the world that are going to be underwater, or major areas such as the Mekong Delta. Mumbai is included in this, and many other, Alexandria in Egypt, many of these places are going to be underwater. The second map that was produced by the New York Times, and I would urge people to try to find this, is the map that shows global warming, and it shows our area here as being an area that is going to be unsustainable.
Yes. Thank you. And look, thank you for that clarification too about the ignition sources for the Californian fires. The only thing I'd add is that California is seeing the same climate impacts that we're seeing in Australia. So you're getting a longer fire season, more windy conditions and drier conditions, all of which make a fire, once it starts, more dangerous. Yeah. Yes, look, that putting people in danger of fire is an issue. We have a saying in Australia among firefighters, whoever owns the fuel owns the fire. And it goes back to that point, at least in Australia, that ignition sources are not the issue. It's the fuel load that's the issue.
Dumping of nuclear waste causing to the climate, and how to address
dumping of nuclear waste and climate change. There may be some link, but I'm not aware of it, so I'm sorry. It's true that we are still in the midst of an energy transition, and in fact that argument could be run for everything we make. So we make solar panels using dirty electricity from fossil fuels. We make electric cars the same way, and we power them the same way. But we persist in building solar panels and wind turbines because they gradually clean up the energy source. And with electric vehicles, we are hoping that as the energy source cleans up, they'll be running on ever more clean fuels. So, I mean, you're quite right that there's probably a role for hybrid cars, very fuel efficient cars, for a while the electricity grid is still dirty. But whatever the rights or wrongs of that, there's barely a major auto manufacturer globally that hasn't got models for electric cars on the drawing boards. And the projections I've seen suggest that by the 2030s, at least for road transport, the majority of cars being sold will be electric. And that'll partly be driven by issues like air quality in New Delhi rather than climate impacts directly. But it's certainly the transition's underway.
Well, we know the governments listen or they don't listen. In India especially, because we are a developing country and a lot of people need more opportunities. So climate change might not be the first thing on the agenda of our government for several reasons. So my suggestion to you and people as such as you who are an inspiration to our generation is if you globally have a network, because what people in our country will believe are facts. And these facts need to be accessible at and since we are technologically connected in this country and very rapid.
Local ones, and the reports are produced in a very easily digestible and understandable way, but there are other sources too. I can't list them all at the moment, but there are reports by various organisations, and the International Energy Agency gives us our figures on emissions and so forth. So yeah, there are some sources.
How far is it going here? Because for us, some of us are using the carbon points being offset against cutting of trees and forests.
Yeah.
So
look,
that is a very big issue currently.
Even though I fully recognise that we're in a new era of climate change, whereby we have to cut emissions and draw gas out of the air. Now, carbon offsetting, it says, let me pollute a little bit here and I'll take it down over here. We're no longer in an era where that makes sense, but I still do it because it's better than doing nothing. But we actually need to move beyond that carbon offsetting mindset if we're to solve the problem. Look, I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure that I can answer that in economic terms. But I guess the world that we're coming out of is a world where certain countries have been particularly blessed by nature and have had energy reserves in the form of fossil fuels that others haven't. So Saudi Arabia and the Middle East have been blessed with oil, Australia has been blessed with coal, and that's set up inherent inequalities in the world. The world that we're moving towards is a world where all energy generation will potentially be local. So we'll have a much more equal playing field across those things. Now you can understand why the vested interests would like to slow that down. Yeah. So, but I do think it's a better world that we're moving to, where energy is going to be abundant and free. Yes.
The climate change and the human pollution is only a side effect of that. It is a collateral damage. And there's not much focus and emphasis on that.
Yeah.
The focus is on the economic prosperity.
Yeah.
My personal feeling is that the situation will only get worse, not better.
Economic growth. So let's take energy. Imagine we're here in India today and we have to decide where to build a new power plant. Would you spend $80 a megawatt to build a wind or solar plant, or $110 a megawatt to build a coal-fired power plant? What would economics tell you to do? It would tell you to build wind and solar because it's cheaper. And that is, those figures may not be exactly right, but that is the reality of the world we live in today. So we have a choice of economic development pathways. Either clean, green economic development pathways that give us some climate stability and give us some solutions to other problems, or we continue on with the economic development pathway we're on, where you get the sort of air pollution that we have in northern India today and the sort of dependence on fossil fuels that we have. So I'm a bit more optimistic than you. I think the younger generation see that very clearly, and more than that, they see opportunity. They see that they can make a good living developing clean energy, or cleaning up environmental outcomes, or recycling CO2 from the atmosphere, or sewage running into a lake. We know we have the technologies with cheap, abundant local energy to make profitable businesses out of it.
There are several technological solutions that you have indicated you believe are going to work. I believe they're not. For example, electric cars merely transfer the point of pollution from the prime mover to the power plant, unless of course you're charging it with solar power, which is not going to be the case, because tellurium and chromium, which go into thin film panels, are going to be in short supply in just about 30-40 years or so. The second thing that you said was that as we increase our energy into renewable energy and make about 5 times the amount of, produce 5 times, there is a very lively debate right now that is going on in peer-reviewed physics journals, which indicates that if you did that, that the waste heat itself is going to cause global warming. So, mere expansion of energy, even if it's by renewables, even if you can do it, which I say you cannot. Renewables cannot replace fossil fuels, which gives us 82% of our total energy today. Cannot replace. We've done these kind of computations and so on. Even if you were able to do it, you would have a problem with waste heat. The other problem that I sense is that you have gently said that we all need to reduce fossil fuels, agreed. But you have not, on the other hand, said that you need to reduce your consumption. The Annex 1 countries, that means the developed countries, which is where the problem really arose from with the Industrial Revolution, whereas your historic emissions are 1,200 tons per person, you know, our emissions are only 35, which brings us to another problem, that as long as you remain within the growth paradigm, that is, you know, the economy keeps on growing, you're not going to get out of this trap, particularly because oil, gas and coal are getting over. Oil in about 40 years, gas in about 60 years, and coal in less than 100 years. So well before you get into all these problems, you're going to have peak oil taking over, and these are both climate change and peak oil are problems which come out of the same issue of growth. So unless you address this problem not just technologically, but in a sense philosophically, politically, sociologically, economically, we're just not going to be able to solve this problem. And I didn't see that part, which I was very hopeful to see in your talk. I did read your first book many years back, that unless you get into the whole business of growth and stopping growth and bringing in equity into the whole world, I don't see how this problem can be solved at all. And what we are doing is marching within 30 years towards a global collapse, just like what happened to the Mayan civilization, to the Polynesians, to the Indus Valley civilization, because of an energy shortage. Sir, what do you have to say?
What I see is a very urgent short-term problem. We are now pushing up against the limits of the Earth system stability. And the sort of changes that ideally would be required, the ones that you talk about, the decreasing demand, changing people's mindset, they're very challenging problems. So I have focused on technology as a short-term bridge to get through those problems. I fundamentally disagree with you about the replacement of fossil fuels with clean energy sources. You know, I remember in Australia 2 decades ago when we started out on this journey, the engineers and others were telling us you cannot have more than 20% renewable energy into the grid, into the southeastern grid. South Australia now produces more than 100% renewable energy. It has barely any fossil fuel sources. And just a month ago, or no, even a week or two ago in Australia, we hit the 50% mark. Only briefly, but hit the 50% mark for clean energy generation. So things are found, ways are found around the shortcomings, the shortages of key rare minerals and those sort of things. And we have to remember solar power isn't the only power. We'd be using wind, there's solar thermal technologies and other options. So I think that energy efficiency has a great role to play and that we need to be much more efficient with everything. We need recycling, but above all we need a rapid transition to a clean energy source, because if we don't embark on that journey, very soon we'll lose the opportunity for climate stability.